Welcome to another AgGateway Global Network video. I'm Jim Wilson, President of AgGateway Global Network, and with me is Andres Ferreyra and Stuart Rhea from Ag Connections. Andres and Stuart will discuss ADAPT work order and related concepts. Andres and Stuart, please tell us what you do for Ag Connections and AgGateway, and then move into your presentation.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Stuart and I work in Connections, which is a farm management information systems company, and our responsibilities deal with integrations between our software and equipment and other sources of information. And we have been very active in AgGateway's field operations work, including the ADAPT team, where we have worked very closely with the data model. So today we're here to talk about work orders, work items, and prescriptions. And before we go much further, let's review the agenda, where we'll first have a little review on the core documents, then jump into work order, work items and work item operations, and prescriptions and the various kinds of prescriptions there are. So let's start with the core documents. During our work with the Spade and Tail projects that provided a set of requirements for the ADAPT team, we defined 5 different important documents that support the business processes of a grower. There's a strategic document called the plan, which describes how a particular crop is going to be grown during an interval of time on a certain amount of land. Then that plan informs a set of tactical documents that support what we call a documentation cycle that is critical for principled decision making. These are observations and measurements, where somebody goes out and observes the state of the field. A recommendation, where somebody with expertise interprets those observations and measurements and recommends a course of action. A work order, where someone with authority takes the recommendation and decides what is going to be done and what kind of field operation may be performed as a result of the above and the details thereof. And then the work order motivates the field operation itself, which in turn is captured by the work record, which describes what was actually done. These relationships are expressed in this diagram we see here. We have a plan that's motivating or informing the observations and measurements, recommendation, and work order. And you see where the field operation is at the bottom, resulting from the work order, and how it's represented by the work record. Over the course of a crop season, this cycle of observing, recommending, deciding what to do, and doing it can happen multiple times. An important point to make here is that there are vastly different degrees of detail with which particular growers express these things, and formality. A large grower might have a department dedicated to keeping track of this because they might have a strong regulatory motivation to keep track of the principled decision making. A smaller grower might not formally even use all of these documents, but might keep some in their head or might use a piece of paper, etc. Also, there might be companies that make very detailed plans. For example, at the beginning of the season, they might have variable rate prescriptions already in place for the fields that they're documenting in a plan. And others might have broad plans of saying for several thousand of acres of a given crop, this is more or less the sequence of things I plan to do. Another way to see the documents is by thinking about the different stakeholders that are involved in the grower's business process. In this case, you've got the grower, you've got an advisor who's going to help the grower make decisions. And you also have a crop scout or other data source. The grower share their plan with the advisor and with the crop scout. The grower might also share a history of work records and observations and measurements with the advisor to enable them to interpret the observations and measurements that the advisor receives from the crop scout over the course of the season in light of past history of that field. Now the advisor, armed with all that information, produces a recommendation. So the advisor sends a recommendation to the grower. It's important to note that that recommendation isn't something that is set in stone. The grower and the advisor might trade some of these recommendations back and forth, successive versions of it, until the grower is satisfied. Then the grower sends a work order over to the service provider. The service provider performs the field operation. The work record comes back to the grower. In turn, the grower can send reports to commercial partners or regulatory agencies, these reports being derivative works from a use of the core documents. So what kind of data is contained in them? We're telling what's being applied, where it's being applied, who's applying it, when the operation happened, and so forth. And we have a separate webinar that talks about these things in greater detail. But today, let's think about products and services. In our last webinar, a couple of days ago, we talked about how we identify the products and services being applied. However, we didn't go into detail about documenting the rates at which these products were applied in the field or where they were being applied. Let's go into more detail. I talked about the document class previously as well, an abstract class that can't be instantiated, so we need to have child classes to take care of the specific details of each point of that documentation cycle. Documents have a compound identifier that allow each document to be uniquely identified and referenced by other documents. We have other properties that allow us to organize and classify the data. Let's go into work order now. Work order is a specialization of documents. What it adds to documents is status updates where the work order can be tagged with information regarding its execution, like saying this is a work order that hasn't been worked on yet, this is a work order that's in progress, this is a work order that's partially complete or that was canceled, so forth. More importantly, a work order has a set of work item IDs. That means it's referencing a set of work items that will specify in detail what we want done. The work order is something that, as I said earlier, has many different degrees of detail depending on the grower that's behind it. Instead of trying to be prescriptive and tell people how to do a work order, instead it accommodates these various degrees of detail. By the way, there's a question about whether there's a YouTube channel to follow, and there is. On YouTube, there's an AgGateway channel that you can find these videos on as they come out of post-production. Be on the lookout for that. All of these videos will be on there eventually. So as I was saying, broad spectrum of industry usage, and therefore we have a flexible definition. So we can accommodate one operation on one field. We can accommodate one operation on multiple fields. We can accommodate multiple operations on one field and multiple operations on multiple fields. During our SPADE project, we accumulated use cases that showed that it was important to be able to do all of this. The general idea is that we need to support the stakeholders where they are, instead of forcing them to conform to a single prescriptive workflow. The moment that you start trying to tell people what to do, they stop using your product. It is very important for us to provide the industry right now with the tools to support principled decision-making. Consumers are demanding it. Regulatory agencies are demanding it. So the growers we support feel that need. Documents have various relationships. The first one is inherent, of course. We said that document was an abstract class and that the other documents are descendants, child classes of document. We don't have observations and measurements shown here, but it is another document as well. They tend to have work items that they link to, except work record, which is the one that actually documents what was really done, which contains these things called log data and summaries, which we will discuss in far greater detail in a separate webinar. So we support other relationships as well through an object called document correlation. The document correlation allows us to have two documents that are named here by reference, the document and another document called the originating document. We specify a relationship between them, and those relationships can be of three kinds. There can either be causal, like for example, a recommendation that ultimately results in a work order or a work order that motivates a work record, for example. Contextual, such as when a document provides support for the interpretation of another one. Think of, for example, material safety data sheets that can enable you to know what to do when you receive a work order. So be able to understand what kind of personal protective equipment the operators need to use and so forth. And compositional is the third kind of relationship, which is where, for example, a set of photos or audio recordings may be considered to form part of a set of observations and measurements, a scouting report, if you will. So as you can see, I'm naming other documents, which we're calling broadly supporting documents, that aren't in that group of core documents before, but we intend to use the document correlation structure for all of them. An important implication of document correlation is that it provides the foundation for our support for principled decision-making and traceability. So if you have a document, you can enable that it doesn't exist in a vacuum, that it tells you where it came from, what other documents gave rise to it. Stuart, do you want to make any additional comments there?
No, I think you've covered it really well.
Okay, so this slide summarizes what was just said, that the documents rarely stand on their own. They exist as part of a complex network of decision-making processes within the grower's operation, and they reflect the data requirements of those corresponding processes. So now let's dive a little deeper into work item and work item operation. And I apologize for the busy slide, but there's a lot of interesting things to discuss here. We talked about the work order being something that accommodated a complex cardinality of field and operation performed. The work item takes us down one step into greater specificity. And it does that by saying, well, the work item represents a pass through a field. So a single pass over a single area is what's represented by the work item. And in that pass, it's describing the allocation of resources in that field operation. And it's describing the desired result. So where is this going to happen? Well, it specifies that through field ID or crop zone ID. It also provides us the boundary that we're going to use. It can tell us who the people are who are involved through the person role IDs list. And it can also tell us the equipment that we're going to use and what configuration for that equipment needs to be used. A set of guidance lines and curves through guidance allocation. And it will, as we'll see, it will go into greater detail telling us what products or services need to be used and what the rates are. Now, it does that through another object, which is an even more specific one called work item operation. Okay, so work item told us all this about where and when and who and the equipment and so forth. But it didn't tell us what operation exactly was being performed. And please note that it also points back to its parent document. Work item operation tells us what operation type we're performing here, like saying, is this a crop protection operation? Am I doing some kind of precision harvesting? Am I doing crop nutrition? What am I doing here? That's the operation type. Like I said earlier, it can give us specific equipment configuration now for a specific implement that will be performing this, and it will reference a prescription. The prescription is where the products and rates exist. Stuart, any additional thoughts about this slide?
Well, this was built to address what the stakeholders felt was a gap in ISO 11783, which, tasks in ISO 11783 do not have this operation perspective to them. And what I mean by that is they don't allow you to kind of separate out some of the resources and declare specifically which operation those resources are being used in. So it was important as we were working through ADAPT and building this that we address that. So you'll see that work item operation allows you to tie particular products in the form of that prescription ID reference, as well as the particular pieces of equipment to a given operation. So even if you're doing multiple operations during your pass over the field, you have a way of knowing what resources are used for which operation.
Excellent, thank you. And some of the multiplicity shown. So you'll see that some of these things are optional. The grower, the farm, the field, crop zone, those things are optional, although that might be a little counterintuitive. The reason they're optional is because they're optional in the ISO XML format defined in ISO 11783. Remaining compatible with ISO XML is an important requirement for ADAPT. So that has provided some additional hoops to jump through. So now let's go into prescription a little more. The prescription is also an abstract class. And it starts simple. Essentially, it's telling us what its identity is, and this suggests that prescriptions are capable of standing alone, of being self-contained. And to support that was important for us because historically in precision agriculture, prescriptions are exchanged between growers and service providers and so forth. That is what everybody's pretty much used to. So it was important for us to be able to support those use cases while at the same time providing prescriptions with a more comprehensive container, such as work items and work orders that they could be handled in. Now, please note that work items also exist in recommendations and in plans, and that prescriptions also happen within those work item operations that are contained within the work items contained in the plans, recommendations, and work orders. So that enables what I mentioned earlier about being able to express very different degrees of detail in a different core document. And we'll discuss how a growing degree of detail can happen as you move from the more general plan to the more specific work order in a moment. So operation type again, field ID. In this case, we definitely want that field ID. We can't get away from it. A crop zone ID is optional because the system in question may or may not support crop zones. But remember that a crop zone was a more specification of where something is being grown, where a given crop is being grown in a time interval. So this allows us to split a field over space in a given crop season. For example, when you are doing some kind of intercropping, you might have multiple varieties or multiple crops in the field at the same time, or maybe splitting the field into blocks for the purposes of simplifying your harvest timing in horticultural context or so forth. It also allows you to split the field into different uses over time. For example, if you want to separately keep track of, say, the soybean and wheat crop costs of production in the same year. So you allocate your soybean crop to that field through crop zone 1, and you allocate your other crop to the field in crop zone 2. You keep them in separate crop zones. You allocate the application of services and products to corresponding crop zone. At the end of the year, you can add up your cost of production for each crop zone separately and thus to each crop. Then we have these RX lookups. These are a very important part of the prescription. We'll look at them in greater detail in a moment. And finally, we have a list of context items, which, as we have described before, is a mechanism for introducing all kinds of geopolitical context-specific information into an ADAPT object. For example, there may be, say, a jurisdiction somewhere that requires that you have a permit, for example, or that you register your prescription in some way. And so there could be a context item defined corresponding to the permit number for that jurisdiction. So the prescription could be tagged with it, and the very specific meaning of that identifier can be preserved. So prescriptions have two child classes. One is the manual prescription, and the other is the spatial prescription. The manual prescription is what you would use to specify a flat rate of application over the field. Still a very frequent, very popular way of performing many applications. What this does is it contains a list of products. The manual prescription contains a list of actually product use records, not of products, I'm sorry. Product use records Each one of these product use records identifies a product using the reference identifier of that product's compound identifier. Then it specifies the rate as a numeric representation value, which, as we've said before, is a bundling together of a value, so a number, if you will, a unit of measure that describes that value, and also the identification of the representation that underlies this. So essentially saying, what does, in this case, it might be, an application of something in units of volume per unit area, for example. Product use also tells us what the applied area for that product is, what the total product was. Essentially laying out the mass balance for the use of that product. You see that rate, applied area, and product total are all optional, but the underlying business rule is that you have to specify at least two of these three in order to fully lay out the mass balance. So the rate multiplied by the applied area will give us the total product, or the total product divided by the rate will give us the applied area, product total divided by applied area will give us the rate, and so forth. So you need to specify at least two of these three so that we know how much of this product was used, which is very important for commercial purposes, for regulatory purposes, and so forth. A very important part of the grower's business process and a field operation is knowing how much was applied. So that's the product uses. And also the manual prescription has a summary value of the total area of the application and can allow us to capture some extensive property of the prescription, like what's the amount of mix or of product that is contained in a tank and how many total tanks were used in the application. Finally, it can specify the application strategy. There are different ways of specifying an application, like I mentioned earlier. Say a rate per area, like saying we're going to apply this product X at a rate of 2 pints per acre or 2 liters per hectare or so forth. We can specify it in rate per tank so that this product use could really be concentrations of that product in the tank, or it could be total product, saying I have applied so many tanks of this product to this field. Stuart, any additional thoughts here?
Only to point out that you can't come up with the total area for a manual prescription by adding up the applied areas of the product use, because that's not really the purpose of the applied area inside of product use. For instance, you may be recording that you seeded half the field with variety A and then half the field with variety B, right? If you did that in that case, you could conceivably add up those two applied areas and you would get a true total area. However, if you're talking about, recording a complete, 100% coverage application of multiple products across the field, then, you can't really do the math that way.
Excellent. Now is the time when we go out of this a little bit and we are going to look at the data model itself, and then we're going to resume for the final slide. Common data model. Stuart, please let me know when you can see it.
I can see it.
Thank you. So this shows us a UML class diagram with all of these things in it, and perhaps I can zoom in a little bit more to make it easier to see this. So we had our prescription. We had the manual prescription that we talked about with product use and application strategy and so forth. But now let's look at spatial prescription. That's the other child class of prescription. Spatial prescription is going to be spatially explicit about where each product was applied and at what rate. Whereas manual prescription was assuming that we have like one big bit of a field or a crop zone. Spatial prescription can break out that field or crop zone into multiple spatial elements, each one of which can be treated separately. First thing that spatial prescription is a few properties that are common to all spatial prescriptions. A bounding box, for example, which gives us coordinates of the corners of that bounding box, an out of field rate and loss of GPS rate, which are quite standard across the industry, and allow the machine to know what to do with the rate of the product under abnormal conditions. Now, spatial prescription, in turn, also has two descendants. It has a vector prescription, and it has a raster grid prescription. Let's take a quick moment to look at what RX rates are, because you saw that in the side of field rate and loss of GPS rate, which are optional, by the way, the type of that data element is an RX rate. And so what an RX rate is essentially a reference to a product tied to a rate value. Okay? And the reference to the product not only references the product through this product ID, but it also lets us know what the numeric representation is. So what kind of product is this? What does the number mean? So is this rate in terms of a volume per unit area? Is this a mass per unit area? So forth. It also has the unit of measure. What this allows us to do is boil the RX rate down to essentially a key value pair. So in order to specify a rate, we don't have to carry all this representation and unit of measure stuff around with us. Instead, we just reference the product lookup ID as a key. That's the reference identifier inside this compound identifier, structure we've discussed in previous webinars, along with a floating point value of a rate. So that's what an RX rate is. You might say, but wait, out of field rate or loss of GPS rate, there's really this RX rates thing, which is an array. Why is RX rates an array? Well, because we might be applying more than one product. Different growers and different machines specify products with different degrees of abstraction. In some cases, the way to go is you can only apply one product, and so therefore that product is going to be a mixed product. So what we do is specify how different products contribute to that mix and what concentration, either intensively through parts per million or percentage by mass, or extensively by saying, I'm defining this product as a tank so many liters or gallons, and I'm going to put so many liters or gallons or kilograms of a product into that tank. Other equipment enables you to independently specify the products that you're going to apply and the rate that you desire to apply them at in the field. And so this mechanism of having RX rates enables both of those visions to be represented in ADAPT. So it's one of those aspects of ADAPT where we're trying to bring different brands of equipment and different ways in which users use that equipment together into a common object model. So let's talk about a vector prescription. So you have your field, you divided it into a series of management zones, and you know that for each one of those management zones, you're going to have a certain set of products applied at a given rate. So for that, what we do is use this RX-shaped lookup. What that is just a list for this prescription of those different geometries, those different polygons, where we're going to apply essentially an RX rate. So a list of rates and products, right? So very simple. You have a vector prescription, which is, say, 5 different management zones. You could have 5 different RX-shaped lookups. Each one of those is a multi-polygon, again, enabling you to do different things. And when I say multi-polygon, I mean Open Geospatial Consortium definition of a multi-polygon, which is a construct that can have multiple outer loops. So if you have 5 different rates, but you have multiple places in the field with each rate, you could have 5 different RX-shaped lookups. Each one, by virtue of being a multi-polygon, could contain all the different places in the field that have that same combination of rates for the product. And then you specify those products and rates using the RX rates that we discussed earlier.
Hey,
alternatively, yes.
Yeah, so we have a question about this section, and the question is, can a prescription be thought of as the smallest atomic level, below or within a work order? Trying to understand more about how prescription fits, and my interest is on the spatial prescriptions in particular.
Okay, let's get to that in just a minute.
Okay.
Thank you. So if instead of thinking about the prescription as somewhere where you have 5 different levels and you multiple geometries that correspond to each level, you want to deal with different little shapes separately. Okay, instead of having for 5 levels, having 5 multi-polygons, you could have one of these shapes for each one of those areas. So let's say you had 5 levels and 6 different places in the field where you're applying each one of those levels. Either represent this in the vector prescription through 30 different RX-shaped lookups, each one representing 1 polygon. Or you can do it with 5 multi-polygons, each one of which has multiple polygons within it. Okay, again, enabling different ways of doing this that are found in the industry. The complete way of representing a vector prescription. The raster grid prescription is quite similar. The way that works, though, is that we're saying first what our origin of coordinates is. So that is a point which has a latitude and longitude. Then we're going to have a certain number of rows and a certain number of columns in that grid. And each cell width and each cell height is specified through a numeric representation value, which in case would be a representation of length. And you have a certain number of rows and columns multiplied by the meters or feet in the width and height. We can understand not only how wide or how tall that whole grid is, but we can also place it in space by virtue of this origin. And after that, we have this RX rates, which is actually a 2-dimensional array in the implementation, shown here just as a list. But in the implementation and code, it's a 2D array. And for each cell defined by a position in that row count or column count, we have a set of RX rates. We don't need a whole RX-shaped lookup like we did in the vector prescription because we already know where it is. So we just have the list of rates for that cell. The reason that we don't do it as an RX rates and instead have the rates broken up independently had to do with implementation details for performance. So that is prescription in the 2 flavors, manual and spatial. Spatial in turn in accordance with 2 different ways of describing space, either through vector or raster grids. Let's address that question. So it was, can prescription be thought of as the smallest atomic level below or within a work order? Well, let's go back briefly to our PowerPoint, where we had the work item and work item operation. About that granularity question. So we had the core documents, had a list of work items. So plan, recommendation, work order. Each one of them has a list of work items. And this is because plans, recommendations, and work orders can be quite abstract. So imagine a plan that might say, I'm going to have 2,000 acres of corn and 2,000 acres of soybeans this season, and I'm going to do this, this, and this. Say a seeding, a couple of crop protection applications, a couple of crop nutrition applications. Each one of those would be a work item, and it would apply to that total area. Right? As we go into recommendations and work orders, that would become more specific. And instead of talking about just total areas, you might talk about specific fields to the point where you get to a work order where maybe what's being specified is, say, spray these 10 fields today with this product at this rate. Well, that's the work order. Fairly high-level thing still. Not as high level as the plan where we were talking in terms of total area. Now we're talking about a set of fields. Well, each work item, as we said, will now bring it down to a specific field. Each work item operation will bring it down to a specific operation being performed on that single pass over a field. Okay, and the prescription is what is specifying the products being applied and the rates at which they're being applied for that work item operation. So in a way, the prescription is a part of a work item operation, which is kind of the finest level of granularity in this document model. However, as we said earlier, prescriptions tend to stand alone in our industry. People are accustomed to exchanging prescriptions. So what we did was enrich the semantics of the prescription a little bit so that they can carry units of measure and representation information, which is something that does not happen in, for example, prescriptions that are represented using shapefiles. So is it possible that prescription is the finest granularity? Yes, from a certain point of view. But remember, the prescription will not have equipment configuration data, which the work item operation will. So in our mind, a prescription is part of a work item operation, but it can also stand alone. So finally, work orders and prescriptions, as we said, document the desired application of products and services in a field operation. They're critically important for supporting principled decision-making. The ADAPT model supports all these flexible definitions, acknowledgement of the reality that different growers and different service providers and different machinery manufacturers use different degrees of detail in their specification of what is going to be done, where it's going to be done, and what number of products can participate in that operation. As for prescriptions, they're relatively distinct and they can stand alone, even if they are formally a component or a part of a work item operation. So we saw manual prescriptions and how they're a way of conveying flat rate information. And then we saw spatial prescriptions that are a way of showing how the rate for all the different products that are being used can vary over space, whether you're defining that space in terms of vector shapes or if you're defining that space in terms of a raster grid. I believe we have more questions. No, just an acknowledgement. Very well. Do we have any more questions?
It's important to note that while ADAPT supports these multiple ways of conveying prescriptions, specifically both vector and raster ways of conveying prescriptions, the plugin that you export data out through may not. And if that's the case, then it's a burden on the plugin to be able to transform a vector prescription into its own internal raster format on its way out, right? So ADAPT is built to be as general as possible in being able to manage the variety of data that people deal with, but it's a burden on those that write plugins to be able to transform the data that is there into something that works appropriately for their platform.
Thank you, Andres. Thank you, Stuart. Well done. And thanks to all of you who are interested in learning about AgGateway, its activities, and its resources. Be sure to check out other videos in the AgGateway Global Network video series. Take care and goodbye.